There are many figures who contribute to history. Most are overlooked, some command the spotlight, and some are simply forgotten. American history is no exception, with heroes, traitors, villains, and simply those who were in the right spot at the right time. But all these figures, good or bad, would contribute to this story, our story. This is Forgotten Figures. Thomas Jonathan Jackson, better known as Stonewall, can be considered one of the greatest military minds of all time. To some, he is a hero. To others, he is a traitor. He was certainly a rebel, but he was still an American general, and bears being remembered for his tactical genius, despite being on the wrong side of history. His importance can best be summed up by Robert E. Lee, who upon Jackson's death remarked, "Jackson has lost his left hand, and I have lost my right." Jackson was born on January 21, 1824, to Jonathan Jackson and Julia Beckwith Neal as the third of 4 children in Clarksburg, Virginia, now part of West Virginia. 2 years later, his father and older sister Elizabeth died of typhoid fever. In 1830, his mother remarried but died the next year during childbirth. Jackson would spend the subsequent years living with his father's brothers. In 1842, he enrolled at the United States Military Academy at West Point, but only got accepted after his congressional district's first choice withdrew his application the day after school started. Jackson was not a very liked student, as he was routinely picked on for being poor, and he sometimes struggled with the workload. But he stuck with it and graduated 17th in his class of 59 in 1846. That same year, American blood had been spilled on American soil, President Polk's rather loose claim to territory along the Rio Grande. Commissioned as second lieutenant, Jackson accompanied the 1st United States Artillery to Mexico in time to participate in the Siege of Veracruz. He also took part in the Battle of Contreras, the Battle of Chapultepec, and the Battle of Mexico City. Through all his fighting, he demonstrated bravery and performed well enough to earn a brevet promotion to major. Upon the war's conclusion, he served in New York and Florida until he retired in 1851. What's interesting to note here is that, like most of his contemporaries who had become major figures in the Civil War, his military experience at this point had been lackluster. In a post-war army, his chances for advancement were slim, and similar to his peers, he found the world outside of the military more alluring. So although he was not in the military, he remained ensconced in military teaching, accepting a professorship at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. Among the many areas he taught were natural and experimental philosophy and artillery tactics. Not surprisingly, he was very unpopular among his students for his cold demeanor and his very odd habits, such as keeping one arm raised in the air while teaching. Believe it or not, his reasoning was that he had an imbalance in his body, and that was the way to fix it. Yeah, he was a little eccentric, and needless to say, he was a bit of a hypochondriac. In hindsight, he may not have been wrong to fear death knocking on his door. In 1853, he married the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, Eleanor Junkin, but the following year, she would die giving birth to a stillborn son. In 1857, Jackson would marry Mary Anna Morrison, and 2 years later, the two would be the happy parents of a baby daughter. Unfortunately, a month later, she too would die. Death seemed to be following Jackson around. The same year of his latest child's death, he would be the VMI officer at the execution of John Brown. Like Jackson, Brown was an eccentric character, and he was the abolitionist who had raided the Federal Armory in Harper's Ferry in the hopes of leading a slave revolt. Jackson was witness to his death and subsequent martyrdom. From the moment John Brown's body hung limp, though, events quickly escalated. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln, despite being left off ballots in the southern states, would go on to be elected 16th President of the United States. By December, South Carolina would vote unanimously to secede from the Union. One surprising thing to note, however, is that as the states began leaving the Union, Jackson desired Virginia to not be one of them. Events were still moving rapidly, and once Fort Sumter surrendered, Virginia would be out of the Union. On April 21, 1861, Jackson would be ordered to command the VMI Corps Cadets. He would soon be commissioned as a colonel by the state and relocated to Harper's Ferry. Shortly after, he would be promoted to brigadier general, and his troops would be placed under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston. Both sides would build, equip, and train their armies until July 21st, when Union General Irvin McDowell marched his force of 35,000 from Washington to attack a Confederate force of 20,000 strung out along the Bull Run River near Manassas Junction. In the first major battle of the Civil War, the Union took an early command of the field and pushed the Confederates back to a line centered on the Henry House Hill. With the benefit of the railroads, Confederate forces began to swell, including a brigade from Harper's Ferry. Seeing disarray before him, Jackson quickly organized the artillery on top of the hill with a line of infantry behind it and began to counter the Union advance. There would be one last push by Union soldiers at Jackson's troops, which held firm, invoking General Bernard B. to exclaim, "There is Jackson, standing like a stone wall. Rally to the Virginians." And just like that, a legend was born. And with the arrival of Jubal Early's forces, the Confederates began to send the Union into a disorganized retreat. The Confederacy could have won independence at that moment had they chased down the Union troops. For Jackson's role in the surprise victory, he would be promoted to Major General and return west to Harper's Ferry to defend the valley from Union advances. The Confederates were in full control of their own destiny as 1861 became 1862. General George B. McClellan replaced McDowell as head of the Army of the Potomac and devised a plan to force the rebel army to lay down their arms. Say what you will about McClellan's Peninsula campaign, it probably would have succeeded if not for Jackson's actions in the valley. In 1862, the Shenandoah Valley was as important to the Confederacy as Amazon is to us in our time. It was also a backdoor to the capital in Washington, and Jackson was able to exploit this weakness to perfection, drawing men away from McClellan as well as to keep Lincoln preoccupied on his rear. The first of these operations would come on March 23rd, with Jackson leading a force of 3,800 against 8,500. Union Commander Colonel Kimball set up a defensive position across the Valley Turnpike and Middle Roads near Kernstown. Jackson sent one brigade to his right and two to attack the left on the high ground of Sandy Ridge. Running low on munition and being heavily outnumbered, the Confederates slowly pulled back. Lincoln got concerned over this movement, despite the Union victory, and would proceed to keep an army between Jackson and the capital at all times. Jackson regrouped his army at Swift Run Gap and was reinforced by General Richard Ewell's division. Leading the Federal effort to force the Confederates from the valley would fall to General Fremont. Here, Jackson's brilliance would shine. Leaving a larger force under Ewell, Jackson took a smaller force east towards Richmond and then vanished, only to reappear via the Staunton Railroad to attack General Robert Milroy, who was in the vanguard of Fremont's forces. In what came to be called the Battle of McDowell on May 8th, Jackson defended his position from a Union attack lasting 4 hours. Milroy's troops then retreated west and allowed Jackson to plot his next move. That next move would take him northwest, where General Banks was located at Strasburg. Here again, Jackson would disappear, this time through the Massanutten Mountains, which split the valley lengthwise. At the end of the mountain range was Front Royal. A small Union garrison held that location until it was overwhelmed on May 23rd. Banks, alarmed that Jackson was now behind him, raced to intercept him at Winchester. Jackson managed to get around Banks and attack his rear as it made its way north towards Winchester. The Battle of Middleton on May 24th sent a portion of Banks's army west out of the valley. He may have overrun Banks's main column, but his troops cost valuable time by looting the captured wagons. The next day, Jackson struck Banks's defensive position south of the town in the First Battle of Winchester. In a 3-hour fight, Banks's men were forced to continue retreating north, but Jackson was unable to capitalize with an exhausted army. On a side note, Winchester exchanged hands numerous times during the war, with some estimates at 60 times. It's incredible what Jackson was able to do in just 1 month's time. He was able to completely evade the Union Army, force part of it west, part of it north, and all with a smaller force. His tactical brilliance does not get enough notoriety in today's time, and he was only getting started. Lincoln planned a 3-pronged offensive that would encircle Jackson and decisively defeat him. Jackson retreated hastily south down the valley to Port Republic and set up a defensive line along the South Fork. The 3 prongs that were intended to attack him were Banks, coming from the north, Fremont attacking from the west, and Major General James Shields attacking from the east. Jackson, looking at a map, saw that Fremont was closest and engaged his forces on June 8th in the Battle of Cross Keys. Positioned there was General Ewell's corps, who hid behind a fence line and vegetation as the Union forces slowly advanced. Union forces suffered heavily as they stalled and then retreated, followed by a Confederate pursuit. By nightfall, Fremont's forces were scattered, and now Jackson turned his attention to Shields' troops, coming from the east. The following day, June 9th, the Battle of Port Republic was fought. Artillery fire from the Union on a high knoll called the Coaling dealt a serious blow to the Confederates, who were advancing over an open plain. A second Confederate force briefly advanced and controlled the Coaling location, only to be repulsed, but upon newly arriving reinforcements, managed to take and hold the position permanently. With control of the high ground, Union forces withdrew north through the valley. Jackson had fought and won 2 successful battles in consecutive days and left the Confederates in firm control of the Shenandoah Valley, and just in the nick of time. On June 1, 1862, Joseph E. Johnston was seriously wounded in the Battle of Seven Pines in McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, and Robert E. Lee was named in command of the Army of Northern Virginia and ordered Jackson east to help lift the siege forming around Richmond. How successful was Jackson's Valley campaign? In 30 days, his army marched 350 miles, beat 3 different Union commanders in 5 decisive battles, causing 5,000 casualties while only losing 2,000 of his own men. As with most careers, there did come a lull and a low point. The military career of Stonewall had seen the highs of conflict in Mexico followed by the lows of garrison duty. The highs of First Bull Run in the Valley campaign would be followed by the lows of the 7 days. Surprisingly, it took Jackson time to get from the valley to the outskirts of Richmond, and once there, he was out of place as a general used to operating on his own and not having to listen to a superior in the field. This became evident during the 7 days battles from June 25th to July 1st. On June 26th, at the Battle of Mechanicsville, Lee had planned for a 2-pronged attack on Union lines, but Jackson failed to appear on time and A.P. Hill's frontal assault ended, predictably, as most frontal assaults do. The next day, Lee again attacked the Union right with A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell. Jackson was to follow up the other two, but again was late arriving, costing the Confederacy in men and allowing the Federal Army to withdraw intact. Wrong directions, countermarching, and exhaustion are usually attributed to Jackson's shortcomings during these days, but the Confederates had pushed the Union Army away from Richmond, and McClellan, whose forward base was along the Pamunkey River, was pushed back to the James River, and thus he gets a pass. June 29th, at the Battle of Savage Station, Jackson once again was late to the battlefield as he was busy rebuilding bridges to cross the Chickahominy River. His tardiness is also blamed on Lee, who sent a confusing message through his chief of staff that made Jackson believe he was to stay north of that river. He arrived too late to make a difference, but the Union Army did keep retreating. The final battle of the 7 days, the Battle of Malvern Hill, proved to be more of the same. Lee had to do a frontal assault on McClellan's defensive position, causing heavy casualties. Delays stalled other Confederate commanders this time, but Jackson was unable to provide the timed artillery barrage due to problems in collecting the artillery pieces. By nightfall, McClellan could have launched a counterattack and swept Lee's army off the map altogether, but instead, he continued to retreat, leaving the field he had just won to Lee. It's clear that Jackson was struggling under Lee's direct command, but his failures during the 7 days aren't entirely his fault. He was late to engage on numerous occasions, but Lee was notorious for vague or confusing orders. A lot of the time, his orders were worded more as a request instead of an order. In any event, Lee still trusted Jackson as his right hand and Longstreet as his left, and rewarded the former with a semi-independent command of attacking General John Pope and the newly formed Army of Virginia. With his previous agility, Jackson rushed north faster than he had moved the previous week and arrived in Gordonsville on July 13th. On August 6th, Pope marched into Culpeper County with the objective of securing the railroad junction at Gordonsville. 3 days later, Jackson crossed the Rapidan River and engaged units of General Banks. A fierce artillery duel erupted, with one calling it the prettiest artillery duel ever witnessed. At around 5 p.m., Banks launched 2 attacks against Jackson, one against the Cedars and the other against the Crittenden Gate. The Confederate line began to fold until Jackson arrived waving a battle flag and a scabbard-covered sword, which ignited a fierce Confederate counterattack, forcing the Federal Army into a retreat. Jackson pursued for an hour and a half until nightfall halted his charge. Thanks to his actions, Robert E. Lee now had the momentum he needed to take his fight from defensive to offensive. He ordered Jackson to make a wide flanking march around the Union right and to get to Pope's rear. The next day, August 26th, Jackson captured Pope's supply depot at Manassas Junction after marching 55 miles in 1 day. Pope, fearing that he was about to be cut off, pursued Jackson to the old battlefield of Bull Run. From August 28th to the 30th, Pope sent his forces piecemeal to attack Jackson as the rest of Lee's army came up to join the battle. Jackson's artillery was able to hold off a Union flanking attack, and Pope's army, in disarray after 3 days of battle, was in retreat, prompting Lee to pursue and push north into Maryland. Yet again, Jackson had shown his tactical brilliance and his willingness to push his army to the extremes. It was his rapid movements that allowed Lee to make his push into Northern Territory. He was continuously making a fool of opposing forces and moving his troops faster than his opposition. When Lee decided to continue advancing north, Jackson's troops on his left wing were at Harper's Ferry, 12 miles away from Longstreet. These two wings would converge to fight the ultimate battle for Southern independence at a small village in Maryland called Sharpsburg. Its defining feature was Antietam Creek, a meandering creek that was deep and swift. On September 16th, McClellan's Army of the Potomac made contact with Lee's Army of Northern Virginia as Hooker's First Corps clashed with Longstreet's troops until evening, when Jackson's forces began to arrive on Lee's left. At dawn on September 17th, Hooker attacked Jackson's left flank in fighting that produced countless attacks and counterattacks across David Miller's cornfield and the Hagerstown Turnpike. In the West Woods, General Edwin Sumner's troops clashed with Jackson's waiting soldiers. Sumner retreated after suffering 50% casualties, and Jackson maintained his position. Fighting was fierce all over, but it was fiercest along the Sunken Road and Burnside Bridge. When the day was over, it was the single bloodiest day in American history. On the 18th, there was no fighting, but Lee began to slowly pull back his army into Virginia. In October, for his role in the fighting, Jackson would be promoted to lieutenant general, the highest rank in either army, although the Confederacy was decidedly more loose with the rank, and he continued operating in the Shenandoah Valley until early November, when General Ambrose Burnside, now in command of the Army of the Potomac, began to move his army. Lee entrenched his army in the town of Fredericksburg on the south side of the Rappahannock, while Burnside sat idle on the north side. Jackson spread his men out in a line stretching from Prospect Hill south to Hamilton's Crossing just outside of town. On December 13th, General George Meade's division attacked in an area to become known as the Slaughter Pen. Nothing was gained by either side, but Jackson led strong counterattacks which prevented Meade from breaking through the Confederate lines. No fighting took place the next day, but it was obvious the Confederates would not be moved. Throughout the winter and early spring of 1863, the two armies stared at each other across the Rappahannock. In April, General Joseph Hooker, now leading the Army of the Potomac, planned to trap Lee in Fredericksburg by leaving a decoy force in the front and marching around Lee's left. On May 1st, Lee swung his army around to face Hooker, who was coming out of the wilderness at an intersection near the Chancellor House. The next day, Jackson was to lead a force of 30,000 in front of the Union Army and swing behind its right flank along the Orange Turnpike. At 5 p.m., Jackson surprised Hooker's right and pushed it back nearly 2 miles. That night, riding through the thick of the wilderness with some aides after a strategy session, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by friendly fire from the 18th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. He was rushed to a nearby field hospital where his arm was amputated. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness until he finally succumbed to his wound on May 10th, with his last words being, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Lee won the Battle of Chancellorsville, but remarked on the loss of his top soldier. "Jackson has lost his left arm, and I have lost my right." The loss of Jackson proved to be one of history's greatest what-ifs, particularly for the Southern cause. Bolstered by his success at Chancellorsville, Lee decided to invade the North yet again, this time at the tiny hamlet of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Perhaps Jackson would have provided the difference, but of course, after 3 days of battle, Lee returned to Virginia, pursued by Grant, who would keep up constant pressure on the Army of Northern Virginia. The Shenandoah Valley, too, would soon be open to Union advances under General Philip Sheridan, who would raid the valley and sap it of usable resources. Sherman, too, would devastate Southern resources by marching through Georgia and up the coast. History will never know what role Jackson would have provided in Gettysburg, but when he wanted to, he would fight. So is Jackson a bad character who should be forgotten? He fought for the Southern cause, but only because he did not want to fight against Virginians. He was a slaveholder, but he only had 6, and half of those he inherited through marriage. He was Christian and held Calvinistic views, including that all human action can never gain God's favor because the relationship was severed by original sin. He believed that when it came time to die, it would be at God's chosen time and not any time before it. When it came to slavery, he believed it was God's will that it exist, regardless of his feelings. In 1855, he began teaching Sunday school classes to slaves, illegal in the eyes of Virginia, and had some slaves beg that he buy them in the hopes of being set free. In 1906, in fact, the Reverend L.L. Downing raised money to have a memorial window dedicated to Jackson, who taught his slave parents in the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in Roanoke, Virginia. In today's PC culture, he is a villain, but in today's world, if your state seceded, where would your loyalties lie? Thanks for watching my video. Please like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, follow me on Twitter at PastAndPresent4. If there are any suggestions for future videos, please comment below. Thanks for watching.
Back in the summer of '61, Stonewall Jackson's fame was won. McDowell marched across Bull Run and went back running to Washington. Come the spring of '62, down the valley old blue light flew. At Kernstown there he picked a fight and gave old Abe a fearsome fright. In the valley, Lincoln cries false alarm. Jackson's in the valley, I'll fear do us harm. Jackson's in the valley, Stonewall is on the loose. Jackson's in the valley, all hell's a breaking loose. Down the valley and back again, Stonewall's boys did fight and win for 2 long months and maybe more. We marched and we fought and we marched some more.